What if the man everyone ignored on a flight, quiet, polite, dressed in a plain suit, turned out to be the one person with the power to change everything? When silence holds more weight than shouting and judgment arrives before landing, you start to wonder, who's really in control? Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The morning light in Atlanta spilled gently over the concrete of Southfield Strip, one of those quieter regional terminals that didn't bother with fanfare. It was the kind of place built for people who already knew where they were going. Engineers flying to testing sites, middle managers on quick in and outs, and the occasional executive who didn't want the PR team waiting at the gate. Inside the Polaris Bay Lounge, things felt a little too still. The kind of stillness that didn't mean peace, more like a glass of water, filled just enough to spill if nudged. Everything gleamed. The brushed aluminum tables, the quiet hum of low-volume jazz, and the glow from tablets held by men in polished loafers and women with high collars. They glanced up now and then, not at the news on TV, not at the staff moving through the room, but at the man who had just walked in. He wasn't flashy, a tall, dark-skinned man in his early 50s with a trim gray beard and a measured gait. He wore a plain brown-gray suit that didn't cling to any label and carried a leather briefcase with edges slightly worn, as if it had been to too many meetings where the room decided he wasn't meant to be there. He walked with the kind of presence that made some look twice and others look away. At the front counter, a young staffer paused as he scanned the man's boarding pass. The smile on his face faltered. Not rude, just uncertain. "Is this for you, sir?" "Just confirming." The man nodded once, slow but clear. No irritation, no explanation. Juno Kersey, seated nearby with her coffee cooling in one hand and an open schematic on her lap, lifted her eyes for a moment. She noticed the hesitation, noted it quietly. She didn't say a word. She never did in situations like that. The man made his way to a corner seat, away from the glass but close enough to see the runway. He sat down and folded his hands. The hum of judgment around him didn't rattle him. He'd heard worse. Somewhere near the snack station, a whisper floated past. "Maybe he's security, a technician?" Someone else laughed under their breath. "Probably just a driver." He didn't flinch, didn't even glance their way. When boarding was called for Summit Flight 87, a charter run used mostly for internal transfers and upper management, the atmosphere shifted just a notch. People started adjusting their jackets, closing laptops, checking phones. He stood when his group was called, presented his ID without comment, and moved toward the gate like every other passenger. But not quite like them. On board the aircraft, the first-class cabin was already set. Plush seats, warm towels, and overly bright smiles for the right people. Gina Halbrick, the lead attendant, was doing her usual pre-flight stroll down the aisle, making mental notes of who looked like they belonged and who didn't. When her eyes landed on him, her steps paused, but only for a second. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "You sure you're in the right section, sir?" she said, soft but firm. He turned to look at her, held the contact just long enough for the moment to stretch, then gave her a polite nod. Not a word. Gina moved on. She didn't offer a towel, didn't ask about a beverage. Across the aisle, Juno slipped into her seat and pulled a blanket up to her lap. She glanced at him again. Longer this time. There was something off about the way he carried himself. Something that didn't match the assumptions swirling quietly around the cabin. 15 minutes into taxiing, the man opened his briefcase. Inside, among the files and folders, one slim manila envelope sat alone. He slid it out and peeled back the flap. The words on the front page were clear: "Internal report, onboarding review, confidential, for executive eyes only." He read it for a moment, expression unchanged, then tucked it away as the aircraft began to move. Outside the window, the sky was bright and steady. The jet engines hummed like a quiet warning. He leaned back and closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen. To the silence, to the tone, to the judgment floating like background noise. It wasn't loud, but it was there. It always was. It wasn't just another flight. It was a test. For them, not for him. The engines hummed steady as the plane rose into the sky, Atlanta slipping away beneath them like a folded page. Inside the first-class cabin, the mood stayed polished and controlled, like a room full of people playing roles they'd memorized too well. But beneath that polished surface, something wasn't quite sitting right. Ellison Morrell had settled into his seat with the kind of posture that said he'd done this before, flown in silence, waited without protest, been overlooked by people who thought they understood him before he opened his mouth. He didn't fidget, didn't check his watch, didn't glance around to see who noticed him. He already knew who had. He leaned his head back gently against the headrest and stared at the overhead light, not really seeing it. His mind had drifted elsewhere, to a winter day 3 decades ago, sitting outside a high-rise in Chicago, waiting for a job interview he'd shown up early for. He remembered the look the receptionist had given him, half pity, half skepticism, and how she'd assumed he was there to fix the copier. That day, a mentor he barely knew had caught him in the hallway afterward and said, "Sometimes silence isn't surrender, it's the preparation before the storm." He'd never forgotten that. This flight, he reminded himself, wasn't about a rude glance or a cold tone. It wasn't even about a cup of water. It was about what those things represented: a pattern, a mindset, a culture. Across the aisle, a tray clinked softly as a young attendant bent to serve a glass of wine to a passenger in the second row. Another cart rolled by, handing out hot towels, small bags of warm nuts. Ellison received neither. The young attendant glanced his way once, hand hovering above the stack of towels, then hesitated. A barely perceptible shake of the head from Gina Halbrick was all it took. The attendant moved on without a word. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. A man 2 rows up leaned toward his neighbor and whispered, not quite softly enough, "Strange. Don't remember seeing him at any leadership meeting." Ellison heard it, didn't blink. 1 row back, Juno Kersey watched the exchange with a practiced calm. She was used to being the quiet one in the room, the engineer who didn't raise her hand unless something was on fire. Her career at Aurelia had been solid but stifled. Technical brilliance tucked behind layers of middle management and male egos. But she noticed things. She always had. And there was something about the way this man sat. Not stiff, not arrogant, just centered. Like he was listening not to the plane, but to the people around him. When he reached down to open his briefcase, she tried not to stare. But a corner of paper slipped out as he adjusted a folder. She caught a glimpse of the heading: Executive Assessment Draft, Internal Culture Audit. Her brows drew together slightly. Not a typical document for someone who didn't belong. She turned her gaze back to her tablet but didn't focus. Her thoughts looped. He's watching all of us. But who's watching him? Time passed like slow water. The quiet built on itself. As the descent began, Gina Halbrick rose from her jump seat and began moving through the cabin. She held a digital list in one hand, checking names against faces. Lips pursed like someone confirming a seating chart at a wedding she didn't want to attend. She stopped at Ellison's row. "Sir," she said, her voice clipped, "we'll need to verify your presence with HR. Please remain seated after landing." Ellison looked up with the same calm he'd carried all flight. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his boarding pass, and with it, a flat white card embossed with gold trim. He handed them to her without a word. The words "Executive Clearance" were printed in clean block letters across the ID. Gina froze for half a second, just long enough. Her eyes darted to his, then back to the card, and something behind them shifted. Her jaw didn't move, but the set of her shoulders changed. She gave the items back, nodding once, too sharp to look natural. She turned quickly and moved on. Juno saw it all. She didn't say a word, but something in her chest tightened. That look on Gina's face, it wasn't confusion. It was recognition. She didn't know who he was, but she was certain of one thing. He wasn't here by accident. By the 3rd hour of the flight, the quiet tension in first class had settled into something heavier. The kind that didn't move but could still be felt, like humidity before a summer storm. Ellison sat without shifting. He hadn't touched the reading light. He hadn't asked for a blanket or a snack. All he had done was exist, and that alone had been enough to make people uncomfortable. The call button above him blinked softly, Barely noticeable to anyone not paying attention, he'd pressed it once, just once. A few moments passed. Then Gina Halbrick appeared at his row, arms crossed neatly over her waist. She didn't kneel like she had for the man in 3A. She didn't ask how he was or if there was anything he needed. She stood above him, eyes narrow and voice clipped. "Sir," she began, "as I said earlier, this section is not for public passengers. You can wait until we land." Her words didn't land like a misunderstanding. They hit like a choice to dismiss, a choice to reduce. Ellison kept his voice even. "I believe I'm entitled to basic service," he said, "just like everyone else here." Gina's eyes dropped, scanning him from his collar down to his shoes. She pressed her lips into a thin line, then replied without emotion, "I'll check with the coordinator. Meanwhile, please refrain from making further requests." Her tone didn't rise, but the weight in it, the chill of it, spoke louder than volume ever could. A man in the row behind cleared his throat, like he was going to say something. But when Gina's eyes flicked his way, he looked back down at his laptop. The silence that followed was loud enough to fill the cabin. Ellison didn't say another word. He reached slowly into the side pocket of his briefcase, pulled out a small notebook bound in brown leather, and opened it to a blank page. He clicked his pen, deliberately, and began to write. His handwriting was neat, methodical. No frustration in the strokes, just control. Juno watched from 2 rows behind. She'd been pretending to scroll through engine maintenance reports on her tablet, but her eyes had locked onto Ellison's hands, then to his face. He was calm, focused, purposeful. He paused, reached into his coat, and pulled out his phone. With a slow swipe, he opened a memo recorder and spoke into it, low but clear. Time, 10:46 a.m. Observation. Willful neglect. Second direct dismissal of standard service protocol. His voice wasn't angry, it was documenting. That's when Juno's gut stirred. Not because she thought he was dangerous, but because she realized he was watching everything. Not like a passenger, not like someone passing through, like someone gathering something. A few rows up, whispers had started to swirl. "Maybe he's auditing us. Think he's from corporate?" The cabin wasn't loud, but the ripple effect was real. Uncertainty moved faster than turbulence ever could. The man who had been invisible was now the center of gravity. A younger flight attendant, maybe mid-20s, approached Juno's row and leaned in slightly. "Do you know him?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Juno looked at Ellison again, then back to the attendant. "No," she said, then added softly, "but I think we'll all know him soon." The attendant nodded once and walked off, suddenly very aware of how visible every action could be. A few minutes later, Gina returned. In her hand was a glass of water, room temperature, no lemon, resting on a napkin that hadn't been folded. But she didn't hand it to him. She didn't smile. She didn't say a word. She placed the drink on the fold-out tray in front of him with a small push, sharp enough that it slid a few inches and splashed slightly over the edge. The liquid dotted the tray in the corner of his sleeve. The silence that followed wasn't casual anymore. It was dense, almost brittle. Ellison reached calmly into his pocket, pulled out a tissue, and dabbed the water from his hand. His face remained unreadable. Then he spoke, just loud enough for her to hear, and for the rows around him to catch every syllable. "Thank you," he said. "This will be useful." He didn't lift his eyes. Gina stood still for a beat, then turned and walked away, a little too quickly, a little too stiff. She'd won the exchange in her mind, but something in the air told a different story. Gina felt uncertain, and everyone else started to feel uncomfortable in her certainty. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane began its slow descent toward early afternoon. Outside, the clouds hung low like curtains being drawn, but inside the aircraft, things had only started to sharpen. Conversations were shorter now, more clipped. A few glances lingered longer than before. Something had shifted, and Juno Kersey could feel it. She waited until the aisle cleared, then made her way to the restroom at the back of the cabin. Once inside, she locked the door, pulled out her phone, and opened the secure company app she rarely used. Her hands moved quickly, typing a name she'd only half seen earlier. Ellison Morell. The result came back empty on the public employee directory. No title, no department. But when she searched her archived inbox, something popped up. An internal email from 2 weeks ago, marked for executive-level visibility only. The message welcomed a new addition to the senior executive team, someone recently brought in from Hightower Aviation for a confidential internal cultural review. The name on the memo, Ellison Merrill. Juno stared at the screen for a long beat. She wasn't easily shaken, but this wasn't just surprising, it was strategic. She whispered under her breath, "Why would someone like him be on this flight, anonymously?" The toilet flushed automatically behind her, jolting her back to the moment. She took a breath, tucked the phone into her blazer, and washed her hands slowly, more for time than hygiene. Back in the cabin, the man in question sat motionless, watching the wingtip tilt toward the horizon, calm as ever. He knew people were starting to piece it together. Ellison had just finished reading a message from his assistant, which had come through on the encrypted comms app. The screen still glowed faintly in his lap. "Your presence has been flagged by crew. Do you wish to proceed with silent audit or reveal clearance?" He didn't respond right away. He stared out the window, not really seeing the skyline, but remembering a different boardroom, a different failure. Years ago, he'd tried something similar at another firm, gone in too soon, revealed too much, and been met with rehearsed smiles and empty apologies. The people who needed to learn had pivoted to performance instead. He told himself never again. If they know too soon, he thought, the lesson won't be real. 2 rows ahead, Gina was starting to unravel, but only on the inside. She still moved with clipped confidence, but the young attendant beside her whispered something that made her eyes narrow. "He might be someone important. You should maybe double-check with ground ops." Gina didn't bother hiding her skepticism. She chuckled, a sharp sound with no warmth. "They always say that," she said. "Next thing you know, everyone's claiming to be corporate. If he was, he'd act like it." Still, something pulled at her. She pulled out her tablet and ran a quick check through the internal roster. The name Ellison Morell appeared, with an access level tagged exec-5. No department listed, no photo on file. She stared at the screen for a moment, then closed it. She told herself it was just a glitch. A name in the system didn't mean power, not necessarily. And yet, she didn't ask him for anything else that flight. As she turned back toward the galley, Juno slipped into the seat beside Ellison. She didn't speak at first, just sat there, legs crossed, hands folded. He didn't look over, but after a while she leaned slightly his way. "Sir," she said quietly, "are you here for something more than just a seat?" He turned to face her. His eyes weren't hard, but they held something deep, something settled, the kind of calm that came not from passivity, but from knowing exactly who you were. "Let's just say," he replied, "I'm not here by chance." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. She nodded once, slowly. Someone saw him. Not the suit, not the skin, but the role he was born to play. The clouds outside were thickening as the plane began its descent. But inside the cabin, it was something else entirely that hung in the air. Heavier than weather, quieter than thunder. Ellison sat still, his hands resting gently on the arms of his seat. Fingers relaxed, but his shoulders just tight enough to betray the storm beneath. He didn't look at anyone, but he could feel their eyes. Every glance was a question now. Every silence was weighted. Juno sat 1 row behind and slightly across, and though she hadn't moved in minutes, she could feel the pressure rising like cabin air before a drop. Ellison's gaze shifted toward the window, not for the view, but to avoid the stares. What he saw in the glass wasn't the skyline or the clouds. It was the ghost of his father, a man with calloused hands and oil-stained fingers, who had worked on planes his whole life, but had never been allowed to board one as a passenger until the day of his retirement. And even then, he'd sat in the back. Ellison remembered the day his father was let go. One argument with a white supervisor, one sentence spoken too loud, and 30 years of loyalty vanished. He kept quiet, Ellison whispered to himself. "I can't afford to." His right hand clenched lightly on the armrest. Just for a moment. A soft chime broke the tension. Somewhere in the first-class cabin, a man with silver hair and a sharp suit looked up from his tablet. He blinked once, then turned toward the person beside him. Wait, this just came in. New CEO announcement heads started turning. The man cleared his throat and read aloud. Ellison Morel, previously COO of Hightower Aviation, will assume CEO duties at Aurelia Air Systems effective today. He'll be making his first appearance at the Atlanta campus this afternoon. The cabin went dead quiet. In the galley, Gina froze. She'd been halfway through writing a note on her service tablet when she heard the name. Her pen paused in midair. Then she looked up just in time to catch nearly every set of eyes slowly turned toward row 4. Ellison didn't shift. Gina stepped out into the aisle, but her movements had changed. Not quite stiff, but no longer fluid. Her confidence, once sharp enough to cut through any small talk, was starting to crack. A woman in 2B leaned over to whisper, "That's him. That's the guy." One of the younger flight attendants, barely out of training, turned to Gina in a panic. "You served him water like—" She trailed off, eyes wide. Gina raised a hand to quiet her. "He didn't identify himself," she said calmly. Too calmly. "There's no protocol for—" But no one was listening anymore. Her words had lost their shape. The authority she'd worn all flight, like a second skin, was slipping. The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was reckoning. Ellison finally turned his head. He didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked around the cabin, meeting a few eyes along the way. There was no anger in his face, no revenge, only clarity. Then, almost as if he were speaking to no one and everyone at once, he said, "Sometimes we don't need to raise our voice when the weight of silence is heavy enough." And somehow that was louder than anything he could have shouted. Gina took a small step back. Not because he'd accused her of anything, he hadn't, but because the truth was already in the room and there was no walking around it. Nobody reached for their coffee. Nobody whispered anymore. Juno sat up a little straighter. She didn't say a word, but her eyes were locked on Ellison now, not in surprise, but in understanding. The plane was still descending, wheels not yet out. But in that moment, it didn't matter where they landed. They didn't need confirmation anymore. They were already standing in the courtroom, and judgment had entered the cabin. The chime for final descent rang out like a whisper no one wanted to hear. The plane dipped slightly, leveling into a gentle glide. But the tension inside the cabin didn't follow. It only thickened. The usual rustle, passengers straightening their backs, buckling belts, checking watches, was missing. Everyone was sitting a little too still, watching, waiting. Gina Halbrook paced slowly near the galley, her clipboard clutched tighter than usual. Her eyes flicked to the cabin every few seconds, scanning the faces. People who'd greeted her hours earlier now avoided her gaze. The power she'd walked on board with had drained, not all at once, but like a slow leak she hadn't noticed until it was too late. Near the center of first class, Ellison Morel remained seated. His fingers rested lightly on his knee, his gaze out the window, expression unreadable. Then slowly, with the kind of calm that draws more attention than a raised voice, he stood. The creak of his seat echoed far louder than it should have. He turned to face the cabin, not towering or imposing, just present, entirely present. "My name is Ellison Morel," he began, his voice quiet but firm, carrying like a clear note in a quiet room. "As of today, I'm your CEO." He paused. "I boarded this flight anonymously to understand how we serve, not just what's on the surface, but what's embedded in our behavior." Not a soul moved, not a breath stirred. Across the aisle, a man slowly lowered his phone, realizing he'd been holding it mid-scroll. A woman further back leaned forward as if trying to hear what she already knew. Gina didn't move at first. She just stared. Then she straightened her blazer and stepped into the aisle, her heels clicking with just a hint too much force. "Sir, if I had known—" Ellison turned to face her. There was no heat in his eyes, no malice, but no softness either. "That's the problem, Ms. Halbrook," he said. "You needed to know someone's title before offering them basic decency." The words were even, not accusing, but they hit their mark like a gavel. Gina opened her mouth again, trying to steady herself. "There's been so much change lately. Stress, new policies. Maybe I misread the situation, but it was never personal." Every word, instead of cleaning the wound, widened it. A few rows back, someone muttered, "Still making it about herself." Gina blinked, then caught herself. She forced a nod and stepped back, but the damage had already settled, not just to her reputation, but to what she had represented the entire flight. Silence followed, not the awkward kind, but the kind that asks, "What now?" Then Juno stood up. She walked forward, slow but steady, stopping just a step from Ellison. She didn't need to raise her voice either. "Sir," she said, "I saw everything, and I stayed quiet." It wasn't a confession. It was a turning point. Ellison looked at her. He smiled, just a little. "Then speak now," he said. "Don't let silence be your legacy." The moment hung in the air. Juno didn't answer with words, just a nod. The kind of nod that says, "I will." Around them, the energy shifted. The crew knew. The passengers knew. No announcement was needed. Something had changed, and it wouldn't go back to the way it was. As the wheels lowered and the engines adjusted for landing, the view outside began to sharpen. Runway lines, airport lights, the shimmer of concrete and steel. But inside the plane, something far more important had begun its descent. The flight was about to land, but for many on board, the real descent had just begun. It was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes with calm, but the kind that settles after the air has been knocked out of a room. The kind that says something irreversible just happened. Everyone in the first-class cabin was watching Gina now. The power had shifted, and they could feel it, like gravity had tilted slightly, and the floor wasn't quite where it used to be. No one said her name, but the silence held it, pressed between looks and shallow breaths. Gina straightened her shoulders, trying to wear confidence like armor, but it didn't fit the same. Her voice, when it came, was tight around the edges. "Sir, I've served this company for 15 years. This was a misunderstanding." She said it with the practiced grace of someone who'd been through performance reviews, disciplinary meetings, and every HR workshop in the book. But something in her tone gave her away. It wasn't conviction. It was fear wearing the mask of formality. Ellison didn't blink. He didn't sigh or soften. His voice came low, steady. 15 years is not an excuse," he said. "It's a responsibility, one you failed." The line landed like a verdict. No need for raised voices, no courtroom, just the truth, spoken plainly. Ellison reached into his blazer, pulled out his phone, and tapped a few times. It was simple, an internal command, short and final. The kind of message that moved quietly through the system but changed everything once it arrived. He looked back at Gina and said, without cruelty, without flourish, "You're relieved of your duties, effective immediately. HR will follow up upon landing." A ripple ran through the cabin. Not gasps, not murmurs. Just a shared, stunned silence that felt heavier than noise. One of the younger attendants placed her hand over her mouth, blinking back tears. A man in the far seat crossed his arms and stared ahead, like he was reevaluating everything he'd assumed about who mattered on this plane. No one clapped. It wasn't that kind of moment. Ellison didn't gloat. He turned toward the center of the aisle and spoke to the room. Not as a man who just fired someone, but as someone setting a foundation. "I'm not here to punish," he said. "I'm here to rebuild. And that begins with accountability." He let the words breathe before continuing. "And it continues with those who choose to speak when it's hardest to." He looked directly at Juno. She stood slowly. Her voice didn't shake. "We can do better," she said. "And we will." That sentence, so simple, seemed to shift something. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a revolution. But it was the start of one. Gina stood frozen for a moment longer. She didn't cry. She didn't shout or argue. Her eyes met Ellison's. There was no challenge in them. Just a flicker of realization. Part anger, part sadness, and something else underneath it all. Something like regret. She gave a small nod, almost to herself, and turned toward the galley. As she walked away, the only sign of what she carried inside was in her hands. Clenched tight, fingers digging into her own palms, like she was still holding on to something she couldn't name, or wouldn't let go of. Ellison watched her go, not with triumph, but with the kind of quiet that comes from knowing something has ended. and something else has just begun. The landing gear dropped. A bump of turbulence passed through the cabin. Outside, the runway was coming into view, but no one seemed focused on it. The plane touched down, but the landing that mattered had already happened, in the conscience of those who watched. The late afternoon sun hit the glass facade of Atlas Core campus just right, giving it the kind of glow reserved for postcards and corporate banners. But no one inside was thinking about appearances today. Word had already traveled, quietly yet unmistakably, through every hallway, break room, and email inbox. Ellison Morrell was in the building. He stepped through the front doors of Aurelia Air Systems headquarters without a single security escort, wearing the same understated suit from that morning's flight. People didn't stop him. They didn't need to. Some nodded. Others pretended to be typing as he passed, unsure what expression fit this moment. This was the man they'd underestimated, the one who'd walked among them not as a title, but as a mirror. He said nothing as he moved through the lobby, but the silence he carried was different now. It wasn't the kind that waited, it was the kind that had already spoken. Across campus, in a quiet HR office, Gina Halbrook opened her laptop to an email flagged, "Internal, Immediate." Her name was at the top. The subject line, "Employment Update." She read it once. Employment status, terminated. Reason, violation of conduct. Section 3.1 and 4.4. That was it. No long paragraphs. No drawn-out explanations. Just a line that ended something she'd spent 15 years believing she had under control. There was no crowd watching her leave. No dramatic exit. Just her reflection in the mirrored panel near the back elevator. Faint, tired, and unfamiliar. She walked out through the south lot, the one no one ever used unless they didn't want to be seen. And even then, her eyes lingered on her reflection in the tinted glass of the sliding door as it closed behind her. A few floors above, Juno Kersey sat at her desk, rereading the message she'd received less than an hour earlier. Invitation, Culture Rebuild Task Force. Your insight and courage during recent events reflect the leadership we want to grow. You stayed silent, then you spoke. That's growth, and we need people who grow. It had come from Ellison himself. She hadn't replied right away. She wanted to be sure. But now, looking around at the shifting energy in the office, she typed 3 words and hit send. Count me in. It didn't feel like a promotion. It felt like a calling, and that to her meant more. 1 week later, the weather had shifted again. Atlanta moved toward spring with that peculiar mix of breeze and stubborn cold air, but the sidewalk outside Bruline Cafe was warm enough for a few scattered customers to sit under the awning. Ellison took his usual spot by the window. He'd been coming here for years, always quiet, always watching, long before he ever wore the CEO title. A young barista approached the table, carrying a ceramic cup on a small tray. She smiled without fanfare. "No need to ask twice this time, sir." He looked up, surprised. She shrugged with a grin. "I remember, 1 sugar, no lemon, and you wrote us a thank you note last summer." He chuckled softly. "That does sound like me." She left him there, steam rising from the cup, light dancing on the table. Outside, people passed with phones in hand, lives moving fast. But inside, something felt still. Not the stillness of inaction, but of rebuilding. He sipped his tea and looked out the window, not to monitor, not to plan, just to reflect. Sometimes leadership didn't announce itself with statements or strategy decks. Sometimes it looked like patience. Sometimes it sounded like restraint. Change didn't arrive with thunder. It came quietly, on a plane, with a question and a cup of water. So what does real leadership look like? Maybe it's not in the uniform, the title, or how loudly someone speaks, but in how they listen, how they hold others accountable, and how they choose dignity over ego. Ellison Morrell didn't raise his voice, but he changed the tone of an entire company. What would you have done if you were on that flight? If this story made you pause and reflect, don't forget to subscribe. More stories like this are on the way.